recently, but I'm giving a commencement address tomorrow at the Zaytuna College, which is a historical moment. It's the first time that a liberal arts college in the United States is being established and having graduating class. So much of the ideas of that college are based on what I've written over the years and spoke to Hamza Yusuf and others who created the college. I decided to come to San Francisco, and I could not come here without coming to the center, which is very dear to my heart. Dr. Peyman Amiri, someone here, both others who founded this center, were in contact with me from the very beginning, and I'm very glad to be here again. This, of course, is an evening which almost coincides with the birth of Hazrat Ali alayhi salam. This is the month of God, Shahrullah, in Arabic, the month of Rajab, at the heart of which stands this remarkable event of the birth of a human being whose description is impossible because in a sense he has infinite dimension within the finite human order. We find no hero like him who was at once a great metaphysician, a great warrior, a great artist. The Kufic script was invented by him, and he is the prototype of the chivalrous and knightly virtues, and a person who only acted because the purity of action. All of you all know the famous poem, the Masnavi, as Ali Abun's Ikhlas Amal, to learn the purity of action from him. And also, of course, his natural balagha is really the foundation of metaphysical thinking in Islam. He is a mirror of the Prophet's inner perfections. Of course, without the Prophet, there would have been no Ali. That Damanito Ali Vali showed, Aine Hagnama Ali showed, as the Persian poem says. It's not to belittle the Prophet, astaghfirullah, because all that Ali had came from the Prophet. But this Ali represents a kind of proliferation in human terms of the perfections, the different dimensions of perfections that exist in the Prophet, but in a very blatant and obvious way. And that is why throughout the history of Islam, the only person whom certain heretics claimed divinity for was Ali. He was divinized by certain heretical sects in Islam, including the Aliullahis in Iran and Kurdistan and other places in Iraq. And there's no other figure in Islamic history about whom this mistake was even made, you might say. So this is a very important event. The birth of Ali represents really the birth of both virtue and courage on the one hand, and pure knowledge and divine knowledge on the other hand in our own beings. So I congratulate everyone in this room on the birthday of this remarkable man, and may he always live within all of you, not the historical Ali, but the real Ali, who is part of the soul of every authentic human being, man and woman alike. I was not asked tonight to speak about this subject. I just said a few words because it coincided with the birth of my own ancestor. But to speak about a very important subject chosen by the people here of religion and culture, the relation between religion and culture. This is one of the most important matters for any religious minority living in America today, or in fact in Western Europe. That is in areas where a culture corresponding to a particular religion has not formed or has been weakened or will not form. And the case of Islam in America is no exception. And it's very important to pay very serious attention to this and not to gloss it over lightly, you might say. First of all, let me begin by saying that throughout the greatest period of human history, there was no culture. People were so cultured that they had no word for culture. Let's remember that. Because culture was everywhere. And in the 15th century France, even, you never refer to la culture française or something like that, because the French who propagated this idea of culture more than the English in the 19th century, or any other place. And there are many languages in the world in which there was no word for culture. And we had to invent it in Islamic languages itself. Use the word farhang in English, in Persian, excuse me. But that's a modern invention based on the classical Persian word not having the same meaning. at all as the present word farhang and the word ma'arif in Arabic, which is completely different from the word culture as we understand it. And the Turks are exceptional. They use the purely Turkish word called kültür, but that's what put modern Turkish aside, which has thrown away all of its Arabic and Persian words and uses European words with some Turkish pronunciation, part of Turkish nationalism. I made this joke in Turkey itself, so I don't mind doing it. I love Turkey itself, but joking aside, the very concept of culture is a modern invention. And it came into being when it began to be lost. It was a product of the creation by modern man of a society, much of which is now made by the machine and no longer human beings. That's how the word culture began. And so gradually the loss of that series of values and ways of doing things and seeing things, which we now call culture, the very loss of it with the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe gradually necessitated the thinking about culture. And so it's only from the 19th century that the word culture has become prevalent. And of course, originally is related to the word to cultivate, which also means to plant, to make something grow. It's very important to know the root of this, because so much discussion is taking place now without really understanding what one is talking about. So the idea of religion and culture is a contemporary issue which never existed for any human collectivity before. What I want to do first is to make this clear as for the traditional religions of the world as they existed, accepting the present day definition of culture, because I cannot do otherwise, and speaking English too right now, than to use the English language, and try to see how religions that they were created were related to what we call culture today. First of all religions created their own culture. Culture in the sense of a worldview, ambience, set of values, of arts, of tastes, of decisions about the nature of things, all of these things together. I don't want to talk here about the modern anthropological division between culture anthropology and natural anthropology or non-cultural, but I want to use the more philosophical definition of culture here and say that all religions created their own culture. No religion was born in a vacuum. And what it did was that when it came into the world, it made use of what was around it, and it created traditional cultures. There's no exception to this. There's no such thing as Hindu culture without Hinduism. There's no such thing as Chinese culture without Confucianism. And we'll just go down the line to give examples all over the map. Now, how did this process carry out? How was it carried out? Because it's very important for the present predicament of people like you in this audience, the Muslims living in America and other religious minorities, and in fact Christians in a civilization which has now marginalized Christian culture. When I say marginalized Christian cultures, I'm not trying to belittle things. All we have to do is remember perhaps the most important work written in the last century, of serious work in the West on Christian culture in English, is the work of T.S. Eliot, Notes on the Definition of Culture, which you should all read, although it was written 60 years ago, what it means to have a Christian culture in the West and why Western culture is no longer Christian. It used to be. It used to be, but it no longer is. So even Christianity is faced with these problems to some extent in a culture which it had created, but which gradually turned against, more or less, against Christianity, at least partly, and became what is called post-Christian. Now, the process by which each religion created its own culture was absorption, transformation, and rejection. All three. That is, depending on the providential character of the religion in question and where it went from a religious point of view, God not only decides the truth of the religion, but also where it's going to grow. We believe that God ordered Gabriel to go to Mecca and not to Jakarta. He didn't want Islam to rise in Eastern Asia. He wanted it to rise in Western Asia. And why was Christ born in Bethlehem and not in Benares? These are not trivial questions. The awareness of the origin of a religion is self-providentially determined from the religious point of view. It's not historical accident. So that awareness, the locality, the locus within which the religion grows, then determines how the religion creates its own culture. It absorbs some things, it transforms some things, and it rejects some things. That's very, very important. And all those things are done according to inner structure and constitution of a particular religion. And it could be very, very different. Christianity opposed Roman sculpture, but did not oppose the art of sculpture. So transformed Roman sculpture. Islam opposed all sculpture, so did not transform pre-Islamic Arabian sculpture, the crude sculpture that they did have. It just rejected it. So there are all kinds of different examples of this to be seen, and it's very, very, I think, important and perhaps informative to point out to some of the examples. Take the case of Islam itself. Islam begins in Arabia. There are certain elements of the culture of pre-Islamic Arabs which Islam absorbed and accepted. The love for nature. There were nomads who loved nature. Therefore, the message of the Quran is replete with reference to nature. It's one of the very, very important messages of the Quran. Now that the pre-Islamic Arabs understand that nature was a symbol of the divine, that's something else. But the love for nature, the Arabic language itself, the beauty of the Arabic language, which the Quran made to reach its peak of eloquence, of balagha, which is the greatest miracle, in fact, of the Islamic revelation. It also transformed some elements of pre-Islamic Arab culture. For example, certain mores of chivalry which the Arabs had, which were tribal, which Islam universalized. That is, allegiance was to the tribe, but within the tribe there was a great deal of loyalty, of bondage, of service to others and so forth. Islam didn't destroy this, it transformed it. It transformed the tribe to the ummah. So we are no longer loyal just to the member of your tribe, but you were supposed to be loyal to the whole of the ummah. Islamic world did not completely succeed in doing this. There's still tribalism going on in certain parts of the Islamic world, but it succeeded to a remarkable extent. It was not 100%. The human order is never perfect. And then Islam rejected completely some aspects of Arab culture, starting, of course, with the worship of idols, but also many other practices, which you all know, but not waste your time. We see exactly the same phenomenon in Persia. When Persia accepted Islam, which was shortly after the Arabs, just a couple of decades, 2-3 decades after the Arabs, exactly the same thing happened, but the elements were not identical. Arabia did not have the same pre-Islamic culture that the Persians had, which was very rich and very vast. And so the whole question of what to absorb was not exactly identical. And again, the genius of the new religion within the Persian soul made the decisions. Some things were absorbed. For example, many aspects of art. The Persian world was very artistic. And they remained so. They made major contributions to Islamic art throughout the ages and many other things. Some things were transformed. Many things were transformed. For example, ethics in Zoroastrianism was very central, but it was always within a dualistic view of the God of good, Ahura Mazda, and the deity of evil, Ahriman. And the emphasis on goodness was preserved, but this duality was broken in favor of the unitary view of Islam. And certain things were totally rejected. totally rejected. For example, the Iranians had produced some very important friezes in the Sassanid period, sculpture friezes, some of which survived in Kermanshah and other places in Iran, and these came to an end. The artistic elan, artistic force within the soul of the Persians was redirected actually in another direction. So the same people who built the Persepolis built the Jama Mosque of Isfahan, which looks very different physically, but contains profound inward relationships between these two periods of history. When we come down later, closer to ourselves, we see some very interesting examples of this. For example, of Muslim India, which occurs really during the last 700 years, mostly, and especially from about the 13th to the 16th, 17th century, when Islam really spread in the subcontinent of India, and it absorbed a lot of things from Hinduism, but they also rejected a lot of things. That what it had to reject was very different. For example, the caste system and the very influential Hindu view of the divinities given statuary form, which must not be confused with the idols in the Quran. They're not the same thing, and Muslims in India realize that, but Islam set itself against that. And so it created something like the Delhi Mosque, which is one of the greatest works of Islamic art, right next to in a country of the great Hindu temples, which are the very antipode from an artistic point of view, but nevertheless both represent peaks of sacred art in the two traditions. The way this dynamic worked in India is very, very interesting because it's more recent, it can be studied, but it shows how Islam transformed much of the culture of India, rejected some things, absorbed something, and also transformed things right before your own eyes. Since I'm a lover of Indian music, I always point to this point. The North Indian music, there was before classical, before Islam came into India, two great schools of Indian music, the Northern and the Southern, Carnatic and Northern music. The Northern music was transformed mostly by Muslims into one of the greatest schools of traditional music in the Islamic world. It's not accidental that 4/5 of all the famous musicians of Indian music in the modern world have all Muslims' names. Pir Vilayat Khan, Ali Akbar Khan, Bismillah Khan, this, that. This is not accidental. Modern Indian nationalism has tried to nationalize this, but this is a part of Islamic culture of India, which of course is also culture of Pakistan. They were both the same country in the larger sense, and also Bangladesh or Bengal. So you have this very, very interesting example, and also parallel with that, the example of two very different worlds, the Malay world, which is Islamicized from the 15th century onward, only 5 centuries ago. And we see in a country like Indonesia how the pre-Islamic culture is transformed into an Islamic culture, again in a very different way than in India or in Arabia, but with the same result, that such an art as the art of batik, the cloth making, which is perhaps the greatest art of the Malay people, is transformed into an Islamic art of a remarkable really quality, which we see today. And also in Black Africa, where the process is going on right now, in countries like Nigeria, Niger, Senegal, when the French took over, it was only 15% Muslim, with all the missionaries and all the pressure of the French military. When the French left, it was 85% Muslim, only 15% Christian and so-called primal religions of Africa. And this transformation came right in the eyes of the French, and you see this transformation of African culture taking place. Some things are accepted, some things are rejected, and some things are transformed. So I just took the example of Islam. I did not talk about other religions. We see that everywhere Islam went, it created a culture, a religious culture, within which people breathe. And when we say people, ordinary people participate in religion, it really meant the religious culture in which they participated. Now, there are certain elements of religion which cannot be culturally bound. They're not culturally bound. I'll give you some examples. La ilaha illallah. There is no divinity but God. That's the culture. That's not a culturally bound statement. It's a statement about the nature of reality. It holds true as much in Jakarta as it does in Morocco, from east to west of Islam. Yes, we say, oh, but this is in the Arabic language. That's not culture. That's the vehicle for the expression of a truth. And within Islam, the institution of namaz, of salat, that is universal. It's not culturally bound. What is culturally bound is the color of the prayer rug on which you pray, or the color of the scarf of the lady who prays. That's culturally bound. But the act itself, the sacred act, is not culturally bound. The Quran itself is not culturally bound. Its calligraphy can be culturally bound in Maghrebi style, it's written, especially in the Maghreb. Other styles are Nastaliq and so forth, it's in Iran and mostly in Pakistan and those regions. Some are more universal, like the Kufic written everywhere. But the text of the Quran and the reality of the Quran is not culturally bound. And the Sharia, the divine law of Islam, is not culturally bound, although it has the elasticity to apply itself to different cultural circumstances when needs be. As we see again in Black Africa quite a bit, I don't have time to get into that. And you have this actually in other religions. It's not unique to Islam. For example, since we're here in San Francisco, most of the people here are Christians who practice religion still. In Christianity, you have the Eucharist. I'm talking about Orthodox and traditional Christianity. You had the Eucharist, which was in Latin, the Mass, until 1864. When the innocent put a stamp of local culture on it by giving it or expressing it in local languages. It was always in Latin, and it was not culturally bound before 1964, excuse me. Before 1964, whether you were an Italian or a Swede, if you were a Catholic, you attended the same Mass. The Eucharist was the same. It transcended cultural idiosyncrasies. And you have that in every religion. The Jews of Europe spoke German or Yiddish. The Jews of Egypt spoke Arabic. But the sacred rites of Judaism, the chanting of the Torah and so forth, were always in Hebrew. And it was trans-cultural, you might say. Yeah, many examples of that. So there's every religion, there is a universal element which transcends cultural changes. But there are secondary elements which are always associated with cultures. Now, this is a very complicated issue. Why is it that in some religions you only have one major cultural expression, in some religions you have many? I cannot get into that in one single lecture tonight, but just to give you an example, in Islam we have several Islamic cultures. We only have one Islamic civilization. People who talk about creating a new Islamic civilization, including my own country, Iran, they don't know what they're talking about. You cannot create a new civilization. Only a new religion can create a new civilization. You can revive a civilization. Yes, Islamic civilization can be revived. You cannot create a new Islamic civilization. That's absurd. But you can always have many cultures. The culture is the plural. You cannot have Islamic civilizations. That's absurd. But you can have different cultures. And Islam developed many different cultures, unified by the few elements that I mentioned and many others, like the metaphysics of La ilaha illallah, like the Sharia, like the Quran and so forth, and the prayers, which are always in Arabic, secular language, whatever your local language happens to be. But these truths, these unitary aspects, were also related to the division of multiplicity of different cultures which came about. God himself, as it says in the Quran, has willed for human beings to follow different ways, different manhaj, different nations. God said in the Quran, if you had wanted to, we could have created you one nation, but we didn't want to. So the diversity itself is part of creation, and since the diversity is there, Islam, despite its universality, had to accept the diversity of various parts of the Ummah. A lot of the great evil that is modernist fundamentalists, who are really as modernist as fundamentalists are, they're opposed to them, make is that they want to impose a uniformity upon Islam which is against Tawheed, which is against divine unity, against God's creation. You've never had Wahhabi Punjabis before. This bastard hybrid new being is killing half the people of Pakistan. I'm being very harsh, but I should be harsh. I should be much harsher than that. It's a modern invention. Islam always accepted diversity of human types and allowed, therefore, deep piety, in different cultures, which were not identical. Anyone who's traveled throughout the Islamic world knows how different they are. I always say jokingly, in the subcontinent of India, most ordinary people think that if you don't eat curry, you're not a Muslim. I mean, this culture level is identified with religion, as it is for most people. In my part of the world, halwa you have to serve if someone has died. But if you don't serve halwa, it's as if his soul will not go to heaven. And it has to be Persian halwa, not halwas made in New York, I mean, the way we make halwa. And all kinds of things like that, these local idiosyncrasies, this is part of human nature, there's no doubt about that. But what was important was that these cultural differences were allowed to flourish, and they enriched Islam and not weakened it. They enriched it to a large extent. And therefore you have what I've called the great 6 zones of Islamic civilization, the 6 major cultural zones. The Arabic, which is the Eastern Arabic and Western Arabic, the line being between Benghazi and Tripoli in the middle of Libya. From Eastern Libya is really part of the Egyptian Arab East world, and Western Libya really belongs to the Maghreb. And that cultural world, you can tell from the dress and their architecture, from the food they eat, the pronunciation of Arabic and so forth and so on. Very subtle things. So we have the Arabic zone, which has 2 parts, Eastern and Western, Mashriq wal Maghrib. Then you have the Persian world, which includes Persia, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and much of Central Asia, Uzbekistan and so forth, which although they speak Uzbek, which is not a Persian language, the culture is predominantly Persian because Central Asia was Islamicized through Persia before the Turkic people descended down into Central Asia at that time, in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And then you have the Turkic world, which is most geographically extended from Vladivostok to Albania. But the center, not Turkish, Turkic world, which is culturally united by the various Altaic Turkic languages, of which the most important, of course, is Turkish, but also Azeri, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, many other languages like that, and which spreads from Eastern Europe all the way across the Asian landmass, the Tatars in the middle of Russia, who now have their own republic, and there are even groups all the way in Eastern Siberia, said Vladivostok, are very widely extended. Then you have Black Africa. Black Africa, which extends from East Africa to West Africa, and again divided 2 branches, East African and West African Islam, of certain diversities, but there's a very profound unity, cultural unity also among these people. And then you have the Malay world and the Indian worlds. The Indian world was Islamicized before the Malay world, and that includes, of course, Pakistan, Muslim India. God help us with this man has come to become Prime Minister yesterday, the great enemy of Islam. I hope God puts some sense in his head. This man Modi, who's murdered already thousands of people in Gujarat, what a world we live in. And Bangladesh, and some people in Nepal and Sri Lanka, that whole Indian subcontinent, and the Malay world, which encompasses the cultures of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and part of southern Thailand, and southern the Philippines, which is totally part of the Islamic world before the Spanish conquest of the 15th century. And then you have outside these major zones, you have one special zone of Islamic culture, which is that of China, Islamic China, which is very little known actually in the West. As now more studies are being made. A very important Islamic community of probably 100 million people, another 25 million people that the Chinese Communist government announces all the time. I keep repeating this story because it's so important. My uncle, my father's brother, was Iranian ambassador to China during the time of Sun Yat-sen in 1922, and long before I was born. And he had told my uncle, that there are 25 million Muslims in China. At that time, there were 300 million Chinese. Then Chinese government decided, of course, a man never changes his word. So there are now still 25 million Muslims, and the population of China is 1,400,000,000. So this is all a lie. There are 100 million people, a very large population, mostly in Western China, but also we are in Eastern China, other places, in Nanking, other places. That's one of the oldest Islamic communities. And from the cultural point of view, it's extremely interesting, because they developed their own Islamic cultural Chinese expression, Chinese cultural expression. For them, they have a calligraphy, the only part of the Islamic world which is done with a brush, not with a reed, in the way that Chinese calligraphy is, but it's Arabic calligraphy, and it's very beautiful and very, very difficult to I had years of calligraphy training. I tried once with a brush. It's very, very difficult to produce a beautiful aleph. A very hard thing to do. But there are many cultural traits. For a long, long time, they refused to have any Islamic text translated into Chinese. And they read it in Persian and Arabic. But from the 17th century onward, they decided to create an Islamic Chinese Confucian culture. And they began with the translation of texts from Arabic and Persian, especially Persian and Sufi texts of Nasafi, Jami, people like that, which are all coming out now. One of my former students, Sachiko Murata, remarkable Japanese woman, and William Chittick, her husband, is also one of my best students. Together they've worked with Tu Weiming, famous Confucian scholars now back in Beijing University from Harvard, and they bring out this whole series of books of Islamic cultural material in Chinese. So Islam was able to create all these zones of various cultures that are extremely important, not only for our knowledge of Islam and Islamic civilization, but what's happening today. And I want to use all of this background material presented to you to come to a question of today. First of all, for most people, the practice of religion is related to practice of a religious culture. I'm a Persian, let me start with myself. For most members of my family, my mother who's died, God bless her soul, my aunts, all these people, when they were in Iran, how did they participate in religion? There were these universal events like saying their prayers, namaz, all right. But it was through cultural expressions of the religion, like Roza Khani, Sina Zani, going to, these are various Shiite practices, mourning of Imam Hussein and other events like that, reading poetry, listening to lamentations and Nohe Khani and all kinds of things like that, none of which are in the Quran, none of which are identical with the expression of Islam and necessarily in other countries. Some countries are similar, like in Iraq or among the Shiites of Pakistan, but if you go to Malaysia, you'll never hear any of these things, you hear other things in its place. So for most human beings who are not philosophers and metaphysicians, a religion is identified with the actual living, almost material, corporeal presence of the sacred in one's life, not with only ideas in the air. Great disservice that modern fundamentalism and Salafism is doing to Islam is to destroy the concrete presence of the sacred in life in name of an abstract idea of unity, tawhid, or something like that. But in all traditional cultures, the religion was felt, not only thought about, but was felt by the things you did, the lady in the kitchen, what the food she was making, the water that you drank, the clothing that you wore, all these rituals that went through life. When the child was born, you would put a Quran under her, a pillow under her head and do this prayer in her ears. None of these are in the Quran, but they're extension really of the teachings of Islam as extended to everyday life. And this is what must be remembered, why culture is so important and why the problem we face today is so crucial for the survival of Islam in this continent, if it's going to survive, and back in the Islamic world, where much of Islamic culture has been destroyed by both not only Western hip-hop and rock music, but also by fundamentalists. Al-Qaeda is doing just as good a job as Elvis Presley in destroying Islamic culture. Don't think they're any different in that. I'm mentioning on purpose two poles, very, very different. That probably didn't come into your mind before. But anyway, let's turn the page a moment and look back what happened in the West. Christianity, like every great religion, created from the ashes of the Roman Empire, a dying Roman Empire, a new civilization with its own distinct culture. Gradually cultures, at first one culture, gradually several cultures, like French, German. When you lived in 13th century France, the culture of the country was Christian culture. You didn't use the word culture because you didn't need to. But no matter how you define it, you cannot call the French culture of the 21st century Christian culture. And most of the French would not want to identify with that. They would not want to identify with that. So gradually, Christianity receded from the very world that it created through its weakness, through its submission to the falsehoods of modern science, the Galileo trial, and all of the ideas that came before of rationalism, of individualism, of nationalism, all kinds of things into which I will not go. Now that force that was able to, if not totally destroy, at least to ghettoize, marginalize Christianity in the West and destroy the integrity of Christian culture. You know, the big debate going on right now between the fundamentalists in the South is that America is a Christian country. It's not a Christian country. I wish America were a Christian country. I could live as a minority in a pious Christian country. But it's not. It's nominally, you can talk about it, but the reality is not there. This change that came about, this tremendous force that was created, the force of secularism and modernism, first destroyed Christian culture or cultures in the West. Then it set about destroying in the rest of the world, which is going on right before our eyes. And this is not a subject for my talk, and I don't want to talk too long, but we know that everywhere that modernism goes, it pits itself against the traditional religions. One of the very perceptive Western scholars of religion, Mircea Eliade, professor at the University of Chicago, has died in his book Secular and the Profane. He writes that secularism will not stop until it has destroyed every vestige of the sacred. It's part of the nature of secularism to try to destroy the sacred. I'm not talking about secularism here like it is in India, which means to allow all the religions to function. I mean it as it's in Turkey, which uses the French word laïcisation in the Turkish pronunciation, and as it came out of the French Revolution. I mean secularism in that sense. That secularism as a negation of the reality of the religious perspective, totally and completely. And that is one of the realities of our day and age. And now this secularism is helped in this process by its own apparent enemy, that is fundamentalism. From one point of view, yes, fundamentalism arose as an opposition to modernism. From another point of view, it's its greatest friend. Who are the two greatest opponents of Islamic art in the Islamic world? The modernists and the fundamentalists. You see the addition of that in the monstrosities which is built around the Kaaba. There's nothing less than monstrosity. It destroyed the sacred site of the center of Islam. With a 100-story building like the Empire State, and the Kaaba looks this big. It's a monstrosity. I don't know how God permits such a thing. And the Muslim people don't say anything. Nobody says anything. Because they want to send their aunt for pilgrimage, they're afraid they won't be given a visa. The greatest paradox of all is that after I talk about all these things, I just received an invitation 2 days ago from the King of Saudi Arabia to be his guest to go to the Hajj next time. I'm not going to go. I will not go until that building is torn down. I've had enough of that. Alhamdulillah, I've visited the Kaaba many, many times before these monstrosities came up. But this monstrosity represents exactly the wedding between modernism and fundamentalism and the destruction of the sacred and the destruction of religious culture. And politically, we see that, of course, in Syria, where the opposition to the Assad government is a combination of the most extreme forms of Muslims and so-called Jeffersonian liberals supported by Mr. Kerry and the American government. So in a sense, you are all paying for the destruction of Islamic culture in Syria. I am also paying, because I also pay taxes. This is the very, very unfortunate wedding that has come about. And so Islamic culture, like all cultures, non-Western cultures, which have a religious character, are threatened actually by both modernism and fundamentalism. In the case of Islam, fundamentalist element is much more brutal because the West is interested in the oil of the Islamic world. If the Islamic world were like Tibet, the things would have been very different. But I will not get into that. It's important to understand the forces that are involved. Now, I want to end by coming down to ourselves. I've had occasion once or twice in America in the last decade to give a lecture on this subject. And I don't have time, my time is almost up, but I want to say a few words about the question of having an American Islamic culture. Is there such a thing possible or not? The first generation of Muslims who came to this country, they were few in number. They tried to preserve the cultural aspect of their Islamic life back home, you might say, back in the Islamic world. Pakistani families tried to preserve much as possible Pakistani traditions, Persian, Arabs, and so on and so on. Then came a larger amount of migration in the 60s and 70s, and also a new generation of children growing up from these parents who were really Americans, who had never seen, let's say, the Badashahi Mosque in Lahore. I've never been to Pakistan. They are Pakistani descent. I only mention Pakistan because there's so many of them, but Persian. There are 1.5 million Iranians living in California since the Iran Revolution of 1979. Hundreds of thousands of people, a lot of them around here. People who had never seen back home and were not like their parents who had been brought up in that culture back there, were half modernized, half traditional, but still had their roots in back home in their own tradition. And this new generation came out into a vacuum, really. Most of the parents were trying to make a living and doing practical things. They did not have time to teach their children cultural matters. The best they could do, if they, at least, was to teach them the prayers or something like that. But the cultural aspect of Islam were not taught to them. Moreover, the cultural aspect of Punjabi Islam oftentimes didn't speak to the young people here. So a very major crisis came up, which also came up for the Jewish people. When it's not only for Muslims, but they had to solve it in their own way. I won't get into that. And also for Greek Orthodox, other groups. But for the Muslims, the question has come up now. All right, now Muslims are becoming economically more viable. They can stand on their own feet. The idea that all Muslim children have to be the doctors or engineers, or the parents will commit suicide, that has to come to an end. But it's still very prevalent among Muslim communities all over the place. I think some of you are laughing, you know that it's not far from the truth. We have to be able to also think, not that we go to Friday morning, yes, we go to mosque and pray, and then we still like, let's say, Persian Gorma Sabzi or curry, but that's the rest, the whole participation is the tradition is that, nothing more. We know that's not going to last, something else has to be done. And an American culture has to be created. Now, is this possible or is it not possible? Everywhere that Islam went, it succeeded in doing so. When Islam took over Albania, even before the Turks reached the center of Europe, in the 14th and 15th century, before the Turks, many Albanians had embraced Islam. Albania had been Muslim for 600 years. Gradually they developed an Albanian Islamic culture. The Albanian language was transformed into an Islamic language. Institutions were created. The Baktashi is this, that, and I will not go into the details. And that's just one example. Take all the way from there to Islam going to the island of Borneo. Wherever Islam went, it had succeeded in doing that. But will it be able to do so in the West? In Europe, it has much less chance. In Europe, Islam is ghettoized, especially in France, which has the largest Muslim population. They really live in a ghetto. And the younger generation of Algerians and Moroccans, they're usually ruthless and a very, very difficult situation. They don't have the economic means and social means of mobility. So the Muslims of America are in a much better situation than those of Europe in being able to create an Islamic American culture. Not only build mosques, that's easy. It's good, but that's not enough. You have to create a culture. And whether the Muslims will be able to do it or not will determine to a large extent whether Islam survives in this country as a major element, or whether it remain ultimately in the ghetto or be absorbed by the larger society. The tragedy is that in America, nothing is really absorbed. This famous saying of a sociologist that is America is a melting pot in which nothing melts. In the sense that except for the German group that first came to America and settled in Delaware and Pennsylvania, all the other groups that came, the English, the Italians, the Greeks, and so forth and so on, they preserved something of their identity. And now, are we going to be like that? Or are we going to enter into the mainstream of American life at the same time preserve our identity, or simply disappear? Disappear and only religiously be called Muslims, but have nothing to say of our own. Because religion, as I said, cannot be practiced without culture. This is a very major challenge that all Muslims face. And the future of Islam in this country, and of course Canada is like this country, and also in Western Europe. I don't mean, of course, Albania and Bosnia and places like that, which have been for centuries Muslim, but in France and England and Germany and so forth, depends to a large extent on this issue. I believe that in order for Islam to survive in the West, not only does the religion of Islam have to be preserved, but two things have to be done. First of all, the preservation and continuation of the Islamic intellectual worldview, a philosophical, metaphysical, intellectual Islamic worldview, which will not accept the prevalent, secularist, God-denying worldview that dominates over Western civilization. The must be based on rejection of this paradigm. And secondly, the creation of an Islamic culture, which is also distinct in the sense that draws from what's in its ambience, but it's not the same thing as, let's say, Indonesian Islamic culture or something like that. For the second question, the great problem is that in all the earlier cases, Islam spread into a society which was traditional. It was much easier to take a piece of Indian flute music and transform it into music for the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi than to take a piece of American jazz and do it. That's the whole problem. That makes it much more difficult. But it's not an impossibility. The creativity is needed, and too little of the creative energy of the Islamic society has been spent in these matters. The first generation or two have spent all their money, all their wealth, all their energy in getting good jobs and getting rich and getting established and having nice homes. All right, this is done. But to survive as a viable and identifiable community, I think the creation of an American Islamic culture is very, very necessary. Of course, nothing is done without the help of God. So I pray and hope that He will help us all. And centers like this, which are intellectually inclined and are not just for simple worshippers, are a very good sign. Every year now I go to Canada, to a conference, about over 20,000 young Muslims who meet in Toronto, and I've been giving lectures the last couple of years, and they asked me to give a lecture last year on philosophy. And there were about 20,000 people in the audience, about 6,000 Pakistani women. I felt embarrassed. How can I speak about philosophy with 6,000 Pakistani women? I should be talking about what's good curry and what's bad curry, which I don't know about. I'm a very bad cook. What am I doing here talking? So I gave it nevertheless the lecture. And I was very honored that when there was a vote taken, what was the best lecture for that 3 days, they chose the one on philosophy, which means that even for an audience such as this is a kind of thirst. And this gave me hope that inshallah this can be done. And in order to do this, you don't need an army, you just need a few people. All major transformations in human history have occurred by the few. Don't forget, all prophets began as one person. When the Prophet ﷺ descended from Mount Hira, he was just one person. And here we are 1400 years later, all his followers. So one should not be discouraged. And inshallah, bi'awn Allah, with the help of God, you will succeed. Alhamdulillah.